Okay, here's where we catch a real break from the College Board. In the past, I had to cover a dizzying array of architecture. I recorded a test review podcast on architecture alone for this unit. With the new curriculum, we only need to cover 4 buildings and their architects and schools. But of course, we missed some treats along the way. The image on the left is a stairwell designed by Belgian Art Nouveau architect Victor Horta. It's paired with Gaudi's famously weird apartment building, the Casa Mila. That's his wild cathedral too, pictured on the right. Both Horta and Gaudi are associated with Art Nouveau and the earlier related arts and crafts schools. Art Nouveau and arts and crafts artists were dedicated to a synthesis of the fine and applied arts. They wanted buildings and their interiors to be works of art harkening back to the great craftsmanship of the Middle Ages. Remember Gothic Revival? But like the architects of the Houses of Parliament, architects and designers of the Art Nouveau and arts and crafts schools did not reject modern materials, in this case iron and concrete. Now yes, the Romans had concrete, but it only re-emerged as a major architectural element in the late 19th century, in part because it works much better reinforced with steel. These structures were likewise designed to capture organic elements. Horta used twining plant designs. Gaudi used curves, a natural shape in nature, and really tried to create buildings that looked as if they had grown from the soil. The architects of the Eiffel Tower, by contrast, made no effort to recapture the past or to imitate nature. This is a monument to modernity, created for the 1889 World's Fair to showcase France's industrial leadership and the new building materials that allowed buildings to soar skyward. But the greater impact of new building technology, in particular the use of metal and the invention of elevators, was that they made skyscrapers possible. This building is not on the list, although another work by the same architect is, and we'll get there in a moment. The Prudential building is considered to be the first masterpiece of early skyscrapers. Rather than disguising the building's inevitable verticality, Sullivan chose to emphasize it with narrow columns of windows. But Sullivan's skyscrapers weren't just rectangular boxes stood on end. He added elegant ornamentation as well. So here is Sullivan's own description of what he was trying to do with this building and with the next, our required work. The tall office building must be every inch a proud and soaring thing, rising in sheer exultation, from the bottom to the top, a unit without a single dissenting line. Sullivan felt that a building's interior function should direct its exterior form, and he coined what is now a famous and beloved of the College Board phrase, form follows function. Actually, I'm going to share the entire quote since it's quite poetic. Whether it be the sweeping eagle in his flight, or the open apple blossom, the toiling workhorse, the blithe swan, the branching oak, the winding stream at its base, the drifting cloud, over all the coursing sun, form ever follows function, and this is the law. So, finally, our first required work of architecture, another Louis Sullivan building. Now you see why I talked about the Art Nouveau movement. Note the elaborate ironwork on the entry level and the curve that sweeps around the corner, giving an organic feel to an otherwise modern geometric structure. So, let's hear from our first architecture presenter. Here's a photo of the building under construction. The steel frame is obvious. And by the way, Sullivan cased the steel in terracotta piping to increase its fire resistance. Indeed, Louis Sullivan's architecture is known as the Chicago School, not only because he worked largely in Chicago, but also because his architectural innovations grew out of the experience of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Huge swaths of downtown Chicago had to be rebuilt, and architects like Sullivan sought out designs and materials that met modern needs and would provide better fire protection. The building is remarkable for its steel frame structure, which allowed a dramatic increase in window area created by bay-wide windows, which in turn allowed for the greatest amount of daylight into the building interior. The large plate glass windows gave pedestrians a glimpse at the merchandise and lured them in from the street. Note the entrance on an oblique or corner angle. This was so it could be seen from both intersecting streets. The cylindrical corner tower emphasizes the building's verticality, an important theme of Sullivan, and the subsequent Bauhaus and International style architects who followed him. Add verticality to juxtaposition is a good word for an art history essay, okay? But notice that the building style also includes Art Nouveau style iron decoration. Sullivan worked before the International style gained full ascendancy, and he never shared their rejection of ornamentation. I've mentioned that Sullivan believed that form should follow function. Note how steel allowed for thin internal columns and big open spaces in a department store. Here's a vintage photograph of this opened up second floor, and here's the department store's elegant dining room. Again, you see the narrow columns. Louis Sullivan's most famous apprentice was Frank Lloyd Wright, also a Chicago architect, and the most important proponent of what came to be known as the Prairie style or Prairie School. Wright was influenced not only by Sullivan, but also by low-slung Japanese architecture and by the wide-open vistas of the prairie. His interior plan for the Roby house was highly innovative. Victorian houses were broken into individual rooms, each with a specific purpose. Wright encouraged open-plan design centered around a hearth that would promote multiple uses and lots of intermingling. So this famous building also used to show up on the AP test all the time. It's off the list and I won't miss it, but I don't think you should miss this episode in architectural history. The Bauhaus School was founded in Weimar, Germany after World War I by Walter Gropius and continued by Mies van der Rohe, who is one of our required artists. It was incubating ground for what came to be known as the International style. These were the form follows function guys, enamored of modern construction technology, simple, clean lines without architectural ornamentation, and a strong focus on excellence in craftsmanship. Another couple of big names associated with the International style are Philip Johnson and Le Corbusier. We will encounter them later today. So let's watch a clip from The Art of the Western World, which will also give us a tour of our next required work, the Villa Savoye, and the work after that, Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. I warn you in advance, the art historian who leads us through this will not win any Academy Awards for great dramatic presentation. But the visuals are helpful. Pay attention to the furniture in the Villa Savoye as well, as it helps capture the design aesthetic of the time. So the Villa Savoye is an International style school built by a famous International style architect, Le Corbusier. Let's hear from our next presenter. The Villa Savoye is probably this architect's best known building from the 1930s, and it had enormous influence on the International style. It was a design to address Le Corbusier's 5 points, the basic tenets in his new architectural aesthetic. These may have shown up in the presentation. Sorry if I'm repeating what you've already heard, but here are the 5 points. 1. Inclusion of ground level supporting beams, which elevate the building from the earth, create a better view, and the sensation that the house was somehow floating on the landscape. This also allowed the garden to extend beneath the house. A functional roof serving as a garden and terrace, and therefore reclaiming that for nature the land occupied by the building. Functional, by the way, is a little problematic. The curse of flat roofs is that they don't drain easily, so they leak, and this house did experience that problem. 3 is an open floor plan, relieved of load-bearing walls, allowing walls to be placed freely and only where they're needed aesthetically. Frank Lloyd Wright used this technique as well. 4. Long horizontal windows providing illumination and ventilation. Again, this shows up in Prairie-style architecture as well. Finally, 5. Unornamented facades serving only as a skin for the wall and windows. No fancy ironwork here. Unlike his earlier town villas, Le Corbusier was able to carefully design all 4 sides of the Villa Savoye to accommodate the view and the orientation of the sun. In other words, it was intended as a rational design for living, or, the phrase he liked to use, a machine for living. Like other architects of the Bauhaus and International style, Le Corbusier, I pronounced that very badly, sorry, was interested in exploring the potential of new materials. This building is made of reinforced concrete. So, what does this building have in common with the Villa Savoye? It's also integrated very closely with its surroundings, which just happen to be a whole lot more interesting. So let's hear from our next presenter. In the past, I warned students that the College Board always asked more or less the same questions about Frank Lloyd Wright, and the answer was always that he sought to establish an organic relationship between structure and site. Note here Wright's focus on the hearth as the center of the home, true of both the Roby house, which we saw earlier, and this required work, falling water. Also note how he employs open plans. Another Wright theme beloved of the College Board is the use of cantilevers. Those balconies extending out over the water are cantilevered. That is, they are attached to the building at just one end. Unfortunately, Wright's design was not as architecturally sound as it was architecturally interesting. It cost $155,000 to build this house in 1939, and it cost $11.5 million to restore it in 1994 because the balconies were sagging. They had to be lifted back in place with steel cables. You may not have time to watch it, but this link takes you to a very interesting 4-minute video that uses computer graphics to show how this house was constructed and designed to tie into its natural environment. We have 2 international style buildings in our list of required works, the Villa Savoye and the Seagram building, constructed many years later. So let's hear from today's final presenter. Here's a question that appeared on a past AP exam from the old curriculum. I've already talked about technological innovations such as the I-beam steel frame and steel reinforced concrete and elevators. Some other technological features of these very high skyscrapers included floors that cantilever from the interior frame so that they don't need thick supporting outer walls. This enables them to use window or curtain walls that are often hung from the floor above and open the building to light. The highly geometric forms show the influence of Mondrian and de Style, remember the Wrightfeld house, as well as the influence of Cubism. The less is more philosophy is reflected in the lack of ornamentation. It's also worth noting that New York City's setback laws required architects to terrace their structures back from the curb to allow sunlight to penetrate to the street. They were worried that New York was becoming a city of urban canyons. The plaza in front of the building integrates it to the surroundings, and it creates a welcome open space in a crowded urban environment. In general, international style architects were very concerned about providing light, hence all the windows. Note too that while this building has the usual spare, mostly unornamented style typical of the international style, the architects have used bronze as an accent. That's part of what keeps the building from being boring. And you'll remember to use the word vertically if you get this kind of an essay, right? Or verticality, excuse me. Okay, we're almost done. In my last lecture, we will head across the Atlantic to the Americas.